metadata, the ties that bind. This presentation is intended to highlight some of the value that can be achieved through use of standards, using geographic metadata as a use case. And to begin, what do we mean when we talk about standards? When we refer to a standard, we essentially are talking about an agreed upon way of doing things that accounts for the requirements, technical criteria, and practices that have been agreed upon by a knowledgeable expert community through some form of consensus. And why do we implement standards? Standards can be applied in many ways, but in essence, we develop and implement standards to improve the consistency, quality, safety, and interoperability of an activity or product. Standards can be developed at many levels, ranging from those that go through rigorous development and approval processes, such as the ones developed by the International Standards Organization, Open Geospatial Consortium, or World Wide Web Consortium, to best practices that are developed through communities of practice and individual organizations. Geographic metadata is used to describe a resource having some association to a position, typically relative to some point on the Earth's surface. This information typically describes the resource in terms of its content, structure, geotemporal location, quality, and lineage, along with other aspects. This information is critical to resource discovery, understanding, use, and maintenance. The application of a geographic metadata standard at the organizational level is a package. Putting aside governance structures and business processes, there are a couple of key aspects to the package that have a major role in supporting metadata stewardship. First is the structure itself, what you can, should, and must collect. The path from a general geographic metadata standard to an implementation by an organization typically involves a number of steps, along with the establishment of guidance and resources used to tailor the content and experience to the needs of the organization. Using ISO 19115 metadata as an example, this content standard was used as the foundation to what is currently known as the Harmonized Profile of ISO 19115, or HNAP, which is the metadata content standard adopted by the federal government for use in describing geospatial data intended for the public. However, the full element set covered by HNAP itself is still quite broad, so individual organizations may still further refine the list of elements deemed mandatory or recommended for its use to ensure that at least the minimum mandatory content is provided. Starting with a recognized content standard such as ISO 19115 or a profile such as HNAP provides efficiencies in determining what is important as opposed to doing this work starting with a blank slate. Once you have a core content structure in place, it is then time to move on to the other aspect of the package. Anchors of various types can be used to help guide and further constrain the content developed by metadata producers. These anchors are useful for ensuring consistency of content, providing opportunity for reuse of existing resources, ensure interoperability at different levels, from structural to semantic and so on, and reduces the judgment calls having to be made by individual metadata producers. Examples include conventions for individual elements, identification and adoption of standardized semantic resources, leveraging reference data from external systems, and also using related resources that are not directly linked to the metadata content itself, but which help to elaborate on the content and structure of the resource being described. Typical examples of conventions that are applied at the element level in the context of metadata produced by federal agencies would include things like standardized structure of names for federal government departments and agencies, the requirement for multilingual support for content, the application of formatting rules arising from standards such as ISO 8601 for date and time, and the use of encoding standards for geographic features developed by the Open Geospatial Consortium. Semantic resources may include formal standards, such as the code list developed by the International Standards Organization for countries and languages. They may be organizational, such as the Government of Canada Core Subject Thesaurus, or they may be thematic, such as the science keywords produced by NASA. Reference data may include sources such as the geodetic parameter dataset produced by the EPSG. Finally, there are other specifications and other supporting resources that may exist which were used in the production of the geospatial asset, which may also be useful in terms of enriching metadata content. These may range from structural specifications, such as a feature catalog, presentation standards, such as portrayal catalogs, or something more comprehensive, like a product specification document. Once an organization has an established standard for collecting its geospatial metadata, the next logical question is, how is this shared and used? A great success story from the Government of Canada perspective has been the Federal Geospatial Platform. This is an internal to Government of Canada platform having 27 contributing agencies. It implements the harmonized North American profile of ISO 19115 and is Canada's node of the Canadian Geospatial Platform. This platform provides interactive search facilities, as well as machine-to-machine interoperability via the Open Geospatial Consortium Catalog Services Web Standard. So even with the capabilities described up to this point, we've come pretty far, but times change. First, our overall approach to metadata creation has begun to evolve. Rather than focusing on a single metadata profile for all purposes, we began to treat discovery and full stewardship metadata differently. It became recognized that there was a need to balance the long-term needs for comprehensive metadata for stewardship with that distinct content necessary just for discovery purposes. It was also recognized that if metadata was created later into a resource's lifecycle, it was far less likely that comprehensive metadata would be created, and that having a level of core content was deemed far better than having no content at all. This shift in thinking lowered the bar to metadata creation significantly. It increased success in obtaining content, and it really simplified the establishment of metadata collection tools and catalogs. In addition to our changing approaches to identifying and defining organizational needs for metadata content and stewardship, the web itself has continued to evolve. So now with the rise of linked open data and the semantic web, we have many more options to consider when handling this content above the traditional approaches. The foundational standards arena has also continued to evolve. ISO, the Open Geospatial Consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, and other standard-setting bodies have continued to advance as well. Finally, work undertaken through communities of practice have greatly enriched the guidance and the content available for metadata producers. With all of the evolution that has taken place, there are really many options to expand the presence of metadata within an organization's information management and technology infrastructure. DCAT and schema.org represent just two options that are available that can be leveraged quite easily, both in the traditional data cataloging sense and also in terms of markup of content just published to the web. Considering now the expanded technology landscape, and also considering the fundamental challenge of metadata suitable for purpose, we're left with the question, how do we rationalize that detailed stewardship metadata with discovery metadata content for the public? We can look to the Government of Canada Open Maps portal as an example of how traditional stewardship level metadata complying with standards such as ISO 19115 can be leveraged to provide succinct discovery-focused metadata in forms that facilitate discovery and reuse using modern vocabulary such as DCAT. The Federal Geospatial Platform is actually one of the platforms contributing content to the Open Maps portal. So the approach enables this marrying of stewardship metadata with discovery without loss. This approach has the benefit of providing increased exposure for resources without burdening the individual custodians and metadata stewards with developing content to multiple standards at once. Providing discovery-level metadata content in forms recognized by internet search engines and web crawlers allows for further reuse to take place. For example, the data set exposed through the Open Maps portal in this case was picked up by Google Dataset Search and is now discoverable through a very Google search engine type interface. Furthermore, Google on the back end has used its resources to also look for duplicate references to the same content in other portals. And here you see that this particular record has been mirrored 3 times. Furthermore, the published content was further mined and linked to other resources. In this particular case, the citation for the scientific paper that accompanied the database was located on Google Scholar, and citations through other resources were noted. So this value added was provided with no effort on the part of the original metadata producer. So where do we go from here? Taking into account the concepts described in this presentation, we can look to the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission for examples of a possible future. The IOC Ocean Info Hub project is an initiative under the International Oceanographic Data and Information Exchange of the IOC. The project focuses on 3 pilot regions: the African region, the Latin America and Caribbean region, and Pacific Small Island Developing States. The project will support capacity development objectives within a number of regional and global frameworks, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Although discovery, access, and use of data information are at the heart of the project, there's a lot to this project that goes beyond traditional geographic metadata development and cataloging. First, the project needs to account for very diverse needs. The initiative is more than just a simple give me your data exercise. The project is attempting to contribute to addressing some of the needs and priorities that were identified through regional engagement completed by the partners involved in the pilot regions. Next, the technical landscape is quite varied across regional partners. There are many established systems and partners, but in reality, the stakeholders that are being approached range from having no capacity to very modern systems and standards. And, learning from past experience within the IODE, it shows that simply building another silo is not a formula for success. We need to account for what already exists. Finally, gaps such as availability of resources, technical expertise, and IT infrastructure need to be accounted for in order to ensure the sustainability of the project for the long term. Taking into account the complexities that come from such a diverse stakeholder community, the result is that the technical focus of the Ocean Info Hub project really lies in the development of a lightweight metadata architecture based on standards such as DCAT and schema.org that present really low barriers to implementation and which can be leveraged with very limited IT infrastructure. The end goal is to better expose and enable linking of resources, and in essence, let the web do some of the heavy lifting for the resource owner, very much like the Government of Canada Open Maps portal. The project is actually following on some previous work on the Otis Catalogue of Sources, which was undertaken by the International Oceanographic Data and Information Exchange. That project identified 16 critical resource types that were deemed important to the marine community and for which a more robust discovery capability was desired. The project had also established a backlog of resources deemed important or relevant that were actually proactively identified by the IODE member states. So of those initial 16 resource types, the Ocean Info Hub is really focused on experts and institutions or organizations, documents, spatial data and maps, research vessels, education and training opportunities, and project information. And currently there is a proposal in place to extend the work that's being initiated under the Ocean Info Hub to the full suite of the International Oceanographic Data and Information Exchange's 100+ centers and partners to provide global marine coverage. There are many resources available to assist organizations in establishing standards for use in geospatial data and information management. And here are just a few examples. For more examples of success achieved through the adoption of standards, the International Standards Organization actually has posted an ISO Standards in Action website. This site is contributed to by nations involved in ISO, and continues to be updated. The World Wide Web Consortium has developed a couple of best practices guides, one focused on data in general and the other on spatial data, that I think provide really good insight and advice on basic practices that really should be embraced by any organization attempting to publish and share data on the web. The UN Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management have developed a framework and a supporting guide intended to assist governments and organizations in integrating standards into the way they operate. The International Standards Organization and the Open Geospatial Consortium are currently working collaboratively to update these documents. And what's interesting is that the supporting standards guide, which talks about the role of standards in geospatial information management, this is going to be migrated from a static resource to a dynamic online web presence. There are a number of supporting resources that will be published with the guide, including inventories of emerging and future standards, standards bodies and associated registries, implementation resources such as vocabularies and code lists, an inventory of standards and profiles and their relevance to different aspects of the global integrated geospatial information framework, and finally community use cases. And definitely I do recommend that people monitor these sites, and when the new versions of these resources are published, I think that they would prove to be quite informative. And finally, at a very practical level, the W3C has undertaken some really interesting work previously to really take commodity standards such as ISO 19115, GCAT and schema.org, and produce a mapping between them. And I think that would be really interesting from the perspective of metadata producers. And the Earth Science Information Partners, ESIP, have also done quite a bit of work in the vocabulary space. In order to really implement standards and make them count, you really need to understand what you want to achieve and ensure that you're considering all the players involved. There are many opportunities to leverage what exists, and in doing so before building something new, really provide some efficiencies. Knowing that there is more than one tool to do the job, and sometimes you need more than one tool. And finally, not only use what you can, but contribute where you can. Participating in the standards development process really provides a lot of opportunities, and there are many ways to participate. And I definitely encourage folks to really consider that. And finally, Canada's Mirror Committee to ISO TC 211 will be hosting a session to allow people to visit and provide an opportunity for questions and answers, and to talk about membership opportunities in the Mirror Committee.
Hi, Tobias. How are you?
How's it going?
I've got an issue with my background, I think. Must be the light.
Oh, yeah, you do.
Yeah, that's a new one. An exciting new twist on the conference. So let's focus on your talk, though. So thanks for that. It was very interesting. I'm also a member of the committee. which was, and just starting to participate really over the last year. I wanted to invite the committee and have you in the conference because I think the work that's being done is so important. I'd ask everybody, the Q&A is open. So if you've got questions, please use the Q&A tool. And I see we've already got one in there. So why don't we just turn to the Q&A? The first one is from Billiana. Great presentation on the importance of standards for stewardship and discovery metadata. Having been involved in FGP and open maps, what do you see as the logical next steps for these initiatives from data discovery perspectives? Thank you, Tobias.
Wow, that is a really good question. Thanks, Billiana. That's a good question. So as John has mentioned, I'm involved in TC211. I'm actually involved in both the Ocean Info Hub and Otis project from the IOC perspective that I mentioned, as well as having recently been involved in the review of the work that's being done with ISO 19115-3. So there's an update to that standard and its implementation. I think, and I've had conversations with NRCan about FGP, for example. So I think, looking at reviewing the harmonized North American profile of ISO 19115, looking for opportunities to modernize that. I think it would be really great to take a closer look at what's being done in these more kind of webby standard spaces. So looking at DCAT, schema.org, the projects that I'm involved in internationally, the message is to basically lower the barriers to entry to the extent possible, which means publish once, fulfill your core mandate, but make the metadata content more easily harvestable and reusable. And I really think that we need to look at that. The FGP, I think, was critical because it gave us a common standard to work to publish geographic metadata. And by doing that, it made it possible for the Open Maps portal to have a single target to ingest and then reproject. But if you look at what is being pushed out from Open Maps, I mean, it's a really light representation of the metadata content. So I'm a purist. I would say more is better. Developing metadata earlier in the data lifecycle is really critical, and maintaining it so that portals like Open Maps have a lot more content to actually work with.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Billiana. Keep them coming. There's a one from Jody here. For a fun new tool, check out, I can't pronounce that.
GeoAPI. Okay. I'm not sure if that's the one that Tom. Okay, so that one's from NRCan. That's great. I haven't seen that one. Tom Krilides with Environment and Climate Change Canada has been heavily involved in metadata and cataloging spaces for quite a while. And he's actually developing the new API-based standard for cataloging for WMO, to support WMO. And I'd be really interested to see that tool. I forget what Tom's project is called, but he actually has a project on GitHub now that is basically implementing a records-based API for cataloging.
Cool.
Operationally, we're still using GeoNetwork as part of the federal geospatial platform. And I know departmentally, we're using, our IT department is implementing a catalog based on, I believe, GeoNetwork 3. Looking at what's available in the open source space, I think would be really useful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jody. Quite a few questions here. I'm going to go to the next one. We would like to strengthen our metadata process and habits in my organization. What way should we start? Any tips or tricks? Thank you.
Okay, so I guess the first question would be is whether or not you actually are using a content standard now. What's really critical is to have a good sense on what your intended use is going to be. So if you're trying to basically implement simple discovery, you could go with something very light. And depending on the number of metadata producers you have, you may be in a position where you can just go with something like DCAT or schema.org and use commodity web authoring tools to generate a lot of your content. But if you're trying to produce robust metadata for data stewardship purposes, I recommend, although 19115 is still very XML based, looking at the content standard, because in terms of its lifecycle coverage, it hits all the major points. You need to pick a content standard or content standards if you're trying to separate some of your stewardship and discovery metadata. Identify what your minimum content is going to be. Strongly recommend looking at how you can standardize on as much of the semantics as possible, using vocabularies and other supporting resources to remove the variability that comes with free text. And you absolutely need to find a tool or tools to do the job. You need tools that are easy for stewards, that are bulletproofed. And finally, the way the Federal Geospatial Platform works is there's a workflow to actually support review and approval of metadata content before it's released, and that's really critical. So once you have the infrastructure bits, you need to train people. You need to have interactive sessions and self-help, and be prepared to, where you can, to invest resources to help in the metadata creation process. For example, in my unit, I have a sub-team that's focused specifically on data publication, and that includes the production of all the metadata content and reviewing it that goes out to the FGP. And that way, we get the contextual information from the clients. We get enough of the structural information about the data structures to be able to develop the metadata, but they're dealing with the majority of the mechanics.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Melanie. There's a lot of information out there. It can get very complex very fast. What would you recommend as the best open resource to demystify metadata for organizations looking to revamp their metadata for improved cataloging and discovery through open tools?
Ooh, that's a good one. That is a good question. I've looked at different resources over the years. If you want to start with the really basics, the W3C document on best practices for data on the web, I think it's a good background read. But there are sites. I'm going to get this wrong because I only go there so often. But the Digital Curation Center, for example, if you want fairly comprehensive content that you can use as a starting point to produce a boiled down view of the world, that would be an opportunity. I would say probably reaching out. I don't know what the metadata landscape looks like on the Government of Canada's GC Collab presence, but I know that there are collaborative groups up there that both the public and internal government employees can get to. And I would be surprised if you would go there and not find a community willing to talk about this stuff. The ESIP and other international organizations, like these open communities of practice, I mean, they're always producing guidance and recommendations, and they're always sprinkling in basic presentation materials on metadata as a topic. And in terms of technical knowledge, like I say, like we have folks like Tom. Canada's fairly heavily involved. We're involved in ISO and OGC, and also between our work with the World Meteorological Organization and Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. There are a lot of technical experts working in that space, and I think that you'd be able to find quite a bit of experience with any questions that you have.
Great, thank you very much. We've got time for one more. HNAP is just Canada. Don't you think it would be worthwhile to actually update NAP to align with -3 and be endorsed with the US and Mexico?
That's a good question. At a minimum, I would love to see HNAP updated. I mean, it's serving its purpose, but you need to keep in mind that it's based on a dated version of the XML encoding of the standard. You know, the XML schemas are not as clean as we'd like them to be. Although, you know, -3 is a fairly fundamental restructuring. You know, I participate in NOAA's Enterprise Metadata Working Group, and it's a challenge. It's a barrier for some organizations to move to -3. Part of it's because they're large organizations and they need the tools. I think we should look at -3 and look for a way to move forward. But you know, one of the reasons why organizations and technology vendors, you know, they align on standards like 19115 is that you know, there's a level of stability there. So love to move forward. You know, there are groups in the US who are working in at least the -2 realm now. But beyond just trying to align in our region, we need to make sure that we have a mechanism for retaining backward compatibility.
Great. And to close us off, maybe tell us a little about what people can expect in the workshop next week and why they might like to attend.
That's a good question. I've been discussing that with my cohorts. It's intended to be basically an open-ended Q&A session. You know, we'll be there on hand. There'll be 4 of us on hand. We'll be talking about or ready to talk about any questions you have in terms of Canada's involvement in TC211 and ISO TC211. You know, the process for becoming a member. If you have questions about what membership really entails. If you're interested in the different opportunities, the different standards areas, we can talk about that. But yeah, I mean, John, I don't know what your feedback loop is for this session, but you know, if there are other topics that folks are interested in having some discussion on, and they want to just submit those here in the chat, we can ensure that we have some additional background material available so that we'll be ready for those discussions.
And we're going to be sharing the email list of everybody who signs up for that workshop before the workshop to you so that you can be in touch with them, or we can do it on your behalf.
Okay.
And send them any extra information. Just to close, why is it important for people to join the committee?
Well, I mean, these standards are prolific. They show up all over the place. You know, this group is Canada's voice into that international body. You know, there's a lot happening now with lighter weight standards that are changing more frequently. But you still have these markets where you need these foundational standards that are stable, that have gone through a rigorous peer review process and have a level of certainty about them. And really, you know, it's an opportunity to help shape the standards that eventually show up in technology offerings. And you know, the group is pretty small, so we can't do it all.
Okay. Well, Tobias, thank you very much. We're heading into a break. I really appreciate you taking the time to share all this information with us, and I encourage everybody that's interested in metadata standards and being part of a community effort. It's a volunteer thing to join the committee. It's important that we do things together. So again, Tobias, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.